Now, is one of the cliched ideas about our society on the cusp of extinction. Generations of politicians have talked about Britain as being, or becoming, or ought to be becoming, a property-owning democracy. Even Labour leaders have been at it. But increasing numbers of people seem to have decided that property has become so scarce and its costs so high that they may never own their own place. One survey out today talked of 2/3 of potential first-time buyers having no chance of buying. The talk is of generation rent. How would that change us?
At Desford, Leicestershire, the first two people's houses are ready for the Minister of Housing, Mr. Harold Macmillan, to inspect with the architect.
Another era, a different housing crisis. Thousands of homes had been destroyed during the Second World War, and both Labour and the Conservatives committed themselves to a massive building programme. In 1953 alone, 300,000 homes were built.
The Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire welcomed Her Majesty to Stevenage, Newtown.
New towns like Stevenage, Milton Keynes and Basildon sprang up.
And here a big crowd assembled to see Her Majesty unveil a commemorative panel.
In 1971, a majority of Britons owned their own home. A third were still housed by the council, but that was soon to plummet. In 1979, the incoming Conservative government introduced a right to buy, and councils were forced to sell their housing stock. 1 million homes were sold off within 10 years, and Margaret Thatcher's new version of a property-owning democracy became a reality. Successive governments continued the policy, but rising house prices and pessimism about the future are threatening to reverse the explosion in home ownership. Is Britain about to go the way of the continent, where renting is the norm? And how would that change us? Well, with us now are Kirsty Allsop from the property series Location, 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 and Owen Hatherley, who's written an architectural guide to Britain's council housing, this is the new ruins of Great Britain, yes?
Well, council housing and sort of regeneration and housing in general, really.
Okay, good. How is Britain going to change if we do become a nation of renters rather than owners?
I think, for a start, it's a long way off, but it's something that it's very important to debate, because there are all sorts of issues about starting families, pensions, care for the elderly, which are wrapped up in whether we buy or we rent.
What do we lose, though, if we become a nation of renters rather than owners?
We lose the ability to pay for our care when we're elderly. At the moment, the pension system does not allow for the majority of people to be paying rent when they are receiving a pension.
So we should view property then as a way of saving money?
Yes, absolutely as a way of saving money. If you pay rent, 25 years of paying rent, that's it, you've got nothing to show for it. If you're paying off a mortgage, 25 years of paying off a mortgage, you own that house. You might be able to help your children in some way and provide for yourself.
At that level, she's quite right. Rent is just money down the drain, isn't it?
Well, I think, you know, to many people, mortgages are, you know, is money down the drain when they get caught in negative
at the end of it.
If they get to the end of it, if they're not repossessed, if they don't have negative equity, I think there's a sense in which people can be, you know, caught for. There can be a sort of a debt trap as much as renting.
Sure, and you've had a roof over your head all that time.
As you would have done if you were renting.
A roof which you control. That's the other thing. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not someone who thinks that buying is for everybody. But I think that if we are going to have a shift, we need to think about it a long way in advance. Young people really need to have lessons in school about mortgages, renting, borrowing money. We need to understand these things, because we have to, no one's going to provide for us in our old age. We have an ageing population, and we have to, and a much longer living population, and we have to find a way to be able to care for ourselves. We cannot expect the state to wade in.
Yeah, you see, I mean, if renting was such a normal, natural thing to do in this society, why did so many people, given the opportunity, buy their council houses?
I think it goes. I think fundamentally, we live in a society in which success is measured by whether you've got onto the property ladder, how well you're doing, what you can show off, how you can keep up with the Joneses. And I think that, you know, that in the late 1970s, when the right to buy was brought in, I think that, you know, that it was a very easy sell for that reason. You bought your council house, you'd arrived.
And I think you're right about that to a certain extent, but I think there's something much more fundamental. I had a taxi driver last week who was 50. He'd been married for 30 years. He'd just paid off his mortgage. He was the first person in his family to have owned a property. And he was incredibly proud of that fact.
You're making his point for him.
No, I am making
success
his point for him.
Success is measured in property ownership.
No, but it's not just about success. It's about something very fundamental. It's about providing for your partner and for your children.
But doesn't something nasty happen as a consequence? And it's this habit in this society of people thinking they can just sit on their fat backsides and do nothing and get wealthier simply because their property, which should be just a roof over their heads.
No, that's very unfair, and you know it. The majority of people who buy, you're playing devil's advocate here. The majority of people who buy, certainly in a previous generation, before lending became easier, had to work very, very hard to get to the point. There is a generation today of young people who aren't prepared to make the sacrifices that their parents made in order to own their own home. People regard 30 as the new 20. And they think they can go to university and they can have 10 years of renting and basically going out every night and not making the huge financial sacrifices that many people made in order to own the house that they live in.
Well, that's a judgment they're entitled to make, isn't it?
They're totally entitled to make it, as long as they don't expect someone else to keep them in their old age.
She's got a point about the choices that young people make, hasn't she?
Well, I think you have to look at the... It's a broader point. Real wages have been falling or stagnant for the last 30 years, and the gap has usually been filled by credit. And at that point, at the same time this has happened, the private renting has, gone from something which was quite a stable option, in which there was a lot of council housing, in which there was a reasonably regulated private rental market, and the latter two, I think, things have near disappeared. I think that the kind of elephant in the room on all this, really, is the fact that the current choice is mortgage or private renting, in which case you're completely at the mercy of your landlord. And I think that there was at some point a third option, which has been deliberately attacked. I mean, everyone mentions the right to buy. What everyone forgets is that at the same time the right to buy was brought in, councils stopped from being able to build council housing, so it was never replaced.
The thing is, people didn't want to live in it very often.
Well, they did, and they liked it so much they bought it in many cases.
Well, why is it that when you go to an area of council housing, you can so readily see those houses which have been bought and are in private ownership and those which are owned by the council? Because the ones in private ownership are so often much better kept.
Well, of course they are, because people in them have enough money to be able to buy them.
No, they have a personal investment in them. They look after them because they, every week, are paying money into their mortgage rather than paying rent. And I go around houses the length, as I'm sure you do, and the length and breadth of the country, and you can see the difference between a rental house and an owned house. As Jeremy's saying, if you own something and you're investing in it, you're saving in it, it's the same as anything you have of value that belongs to you, and you do your best to preserve it.
But that's a selfish action rather than a social action.
You see, that's where I disagree with you. I don't think it's a selfish action. I think it's about family and about children and about the future and about thinking about the future. And I think that that's something that previous generations did. It sounds incredibly old-fashioned to say this, but in the past, young men, when they left school, they thought, well, I've got to start saving because I can't ask my girlfriend to marry me until I'm capable of either renting somewhere or putting a roof over her head that I own. That was a priority for many young couples. They stayed at home, they didn't get married, they snogged in cars in woods, and they waited, and they saved up.
OK, well, I think on that snogging note we'll stop. Thank you very much indeed.